In a galaxy governed by an unspoken hierarchy, there was a universal truth: the elite bounty hunters ruled the stars. They moved across planets with swagger, feared by criminals and admired by citizens. No corner of the galaxy could hide from their reach, and no outlaw stood a chance once they were marked for capture. Among these hardened hunters, Earth had always been a joke. A small, insignificant world where outlaws were weak and unorganized, barely worth the effort of interstellar bounty hunters. Earth's criminals were seen as backward, primitive, and easy targets. At a dimly lit table in a spaceport cantina, a group of these bounty hunters gathered, their conversations filled with stories of past victories and the feebleness of Earth's criminals. They chuckled over exaggerated tales of Earth's outlaw gangs, comparing them to harmless pests, not worth their time. They laughed about how they could handle an entire city's worth of Earth's criminals without breaking a sweat. The universe was vast, and there were bigger, more dangerous bounties to chase. Earth was at the bottom of their list. One hunter, a hulking creature with thick, armored skin, leaned back in his chair. His deep voice boomed with amusement as he recounted a recent trip to Earth. "These humans think they're tough, but they barely know how to handle a blaster," he mocked, shaking his head. "I had a group of 10 Earth outlaws surrender without a fight. Pathetic." The others laughed, raising their glasses in agreement. But among the laughter there was a pause. One hunter, a seasoned veteran with countless successful captures, lowered his glass and glanced around the table. "You hear about that one, though?" he muttered. "The Gunslinger?" The mention of the name quieted the group for a moment. Some shifted in their seats, while others dismissed it with a wave. "Just another Earth legend," one hunter scoffed, shaking his head. "Like their wild tales of cowboys and outlaws. Some kind of myth to make their criminals sound dangerous." But the veteran hunter wasn't so quick to laugh. "I've heard more than a few whispers about him. Apparently, he's taken down a few bounty hunters already. Quiet, quick, and never leaves a trace. They say he doesn't miss." The others rolled their eyes, not wanting to believe that an Earth outlaw could pose any real threat. But in the back of their minds, something about the tale seemed to stick. Still, no one was willing to admit it out loud. For them, Earth was still a place of easy targets and insignificant criminals. Their arrogance was their shield, and they felt untouchable in their advanced suits and with their high-tech weapons. Earth, to them, was no more than a primitive planet with primitive people. They had no reason to think otherwise. They finished their drinks and moved on to their next conversation, laughing about their next easy payday. But rumors, as they tend to, had a way of spreading. Back on Earth, in the dusty, lawless towns where outlaws ruled, the name of the Gunslinger was spoken in hushed tones. No one knew much about him, only that when the situation became dire, he would appear. No one saw where he came from, and no one knew where he went after. All they knew was that when he arrived, the tide of battle shifted, and those who faced him rarely walked away. The Galactic bounty hunters, oblivious to the true nature of their next target, set their sights on Earth once more. A new bounty had been posted for a group of outlaws causing trouble in a small, desolate town on the planet. The bounty hunters laughed as they prepared their ship, knowing this would be another easy mission, another story to add to their collection of Earth's weaknesses. The moment they landed on Earth, the dust cloud kicked up around them, blending with the eerie silence of the town. The buildings were worn and cracked, a testament to years of neglect. The few locals who remained peered out from behind closed shutters, fear etched into their faces. The bounty hunters stepped off their ship, weapons in hand, their confidence evident in every step. As they walked through the deserted streets, they didn't notice the eyes watching them from the shadows. They didn't sense the tension in the air, the way the town seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The bounty hunters spread out, calling out to the outlaws they had come to capture, expecting to be met with resistance. Instead, they were met with silence. They captured the first outlaw without a fight. The second went down just as easily. The bounty hunters smirked at each other, once again proving to themselves that Earth was nothing to fear. But something was off. There was a feeling in the air, an unspoken warning that none of them acknowledged. As they moved deeper into the town, the whispers of the Gunslinger began to reach their ears. "He's coming!" a voice muttered from behind a closed door. The Gunslinger doesn't let outsiders take over. The bounty hunters dismissed the words as nothing more than local superstition. They had heard tales like this on countless worlds before, always exaggerated, always false. Still, the whispers continued. The name of the Gunslinger was on every tongue, but no one seemed to know where he was or when he would appear. The bounty hunters ignored the growing tension, confident that their weapons and experience would be more than enough to handle any challenge Earth could throw at them. But as they moved through the town, capturing more outlaws and growing more complacent, a shadow began to loom over them. They didn't know it yet, but the real hunt was about to begin. The Gunslinger was out there, watching, waiting. And for the first time in their careers, the bounty hunters were about to face a challenge they hadn't prepared for. The legend they had laughed at, the Gunslinger they had dismissed, was far more real than they ever imagined. The bounty hunters made their way through the dusty streets, their armored boots crunching against the dry earth. Their laughter had died down, replaced by a tense silence. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement in the distance, a shadow that lingered just out of sight. They had been on plenty of missions before, faced all kinds of dangers, but something about this place felt different. They entered the heart of the town, the buildings worn and cracked from years of neglect. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the faint creak of a rusted weather vane spinning in the wind. The locals had vanished, retreating into their homes, leaving the streets deserted. The bounty hunters spread out, their hands resting on their weapons, their confidence slowly eroding. A distant gunshot echoed through the stillness, cutting through the silence like a blade. The leader of the hunters, a tall figure in sleek, black armor, raised a hand to halt the group. "That didn't sound like one of ours," he muttered. Another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. The hunters exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from arrogant confidence to uneasy wariness. They split up, fanning out to cover more ground. One of the hunters, a large, muscular brute with a blaster rifle slung across his back, moved toward the sound. His steps were heavy, his armor clinking with each movement. As he turned a corner, he spotted a figure lying face down in the dirt. It was one of the outlaws they had captured earlier, now lifeless. A single bullet hole was neatly placed between the man's eyes. The hunter frowned, crouching down to inspect the body. The shot was precise, professional. Whoever had taken the shot knew exactly what they were doing. Before the hunter could react, a soft click echoed from behind him. He turned, only to see a figure standing in the shadows, barely visible. A single flash of light, and then darkness. The hunter collapsed to the ground, his armor smoking from the pinpoint shot that had pierced through a vulnerable gap in the plating. Back at the center of town, the leader of the group received the alert that one of his men had gone dark. He cursed under his breath, signaling the others to regroup. "We've got a problem," he growled. "Someone's picking us off." The hunters closed in around him, their movements more cautious now, eyes scanning every shadow, every rooftop. Another shot rang out, and another hunter dropped. This time, it was quick, just a whisper of movement, and then silence. The remaining hunters huddled together, their bravado shattered. Whoever was hunting them was moving fast, too fast. They hadn't seen a single face, hadn't caught more than a fleeting glimpse of the figure in the shadows. The leader barked orders, his voice tight with frustration. "We need to draw him out. Use the outlaws as bait if we have to." But before they could execute their plan, the ground beneath them shifted. A cloud of dust erupted as a small explosion went off near their feet, forcing them to scatter. The gunslinger had set traps, leading them exactly where he wanted. In the chaos, another hunter fell, taken down by a quick, efficient shot. The remaining bounty hunters were now down to half their original number, their once unwavering confidence replaced by raw fear. They hadn't even seen their attacker's face. The gunslinger was a ghost, striking from the shadows and disappearing before they could react. Panic began to set in. They had underestimated Earth. They had underestimated the gunslinger. The stories they had dismissed as nothing more than local legend were proving to be all too real. The leader of the group clenched his jaw, his mind racing. "We need to fall back," he ordered. "Regroup at the ship. We're not prepared for this." But as they made their retreat, the gunslinger didn't let up. He moved through the town with silent precision, using the terrain to his advantage. Every step the bounty hunters took was calculated, their path leading them deeper into his trap. The once empty streets now felt like a maze, every turn a potential ambush. One by one, the bounty hunters fell, their advanced technology useless against the gunslinger's unrelenting assault. He didn't rely on brute force or overwhelming firepower. He didn't need to. His tactics were simple but effective, exploiting the weaknesses in their high-tech armor, using the environment to outsmart them at every turn. By the time the leader reached the edge of town, he was alone. His team, once the finest bounty hunters in the galaxy, had been reduced to nothing more than casualties. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the gunslinger. But there was nothing, no movement, no sound. The leader's grip tightened on his weapon. He wasn't about to go down without a fight. He had faced dangerous criminals before, but this was different. The gunslinger wasn't just an outlaw. He was something else, something far more dangerous. He took a deep breath, steadying his aim. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Show yourself." But the gunslinger didn't play by anyone's rules but his own. Instead of revealing himself, he struck from behind. The leader felt the sharp sting of a bullet grazing his armor, just enough to throw him off balance. He spun around, firing wildly into the empty air, but his shots hit nothing but dust. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the attack stopped. The leader stood alone, breathing heavily, his weapon raised, but there was no sign of his enemy. The gunslinger had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but the bodies of the fallen hunters and the echo of their defeat. For the first time in his career, the leader of the bounty hunters felt the sting of failure. He had laughed at the stories, mocked the idea that an Earth outlaw could be a threat. But now, standing amidst the wreckage of his team, he realized just how wrong he had been. The remaining bounty hunters regrouped, their earlier arrogance shattered, replaced by fear. Every step they took felt heavy, every sound around them magnified. They moved cautiously, weapons raised, expecting an attack at any moment. They were no longer in control. They had become the hunted. Each of them scanned the streets, rooftops, and shadows, but there was no sign of the gunslinger. Tension hung in the air like a thick fog. The leader clenched his jaw, his mind racing through possible strategies. Technology had always given them an advantage, but against this opponent, it felt useless. Their advanced scanners picked up nothing, no movement, no heat signatures, as if the gunslinger were a ghost. He wasn't fighting on their terms. He was choosing when and where to strike, forcing them into unfamiliar territory. They moved through the abandoned streets, keeping close, using every bit of cover they could find. But the town itself seemed to turn against them. Every alley, every building was a potential ambush point, and the gunslinger knew it well. He had the upper hand, and they knew it. The leader's frustration grew with each passing minute. His men were some of the best in the galaxy, but here, they were outclassed by one man. Suddenly, another shot rang out, and one of the hunters dropped to the ground, his armor pierced with surgical precision. The others scattered, ducking behind cover, but the attack had already ended. The gunslinger moved too fast, too silently. Each shot was a statement, reminding them that they were no match for him. The leader's hand tightened around his weapon, his heart pounding in his chest. Their tactics changed. They couldn't afford to engage him on his terms any longer. They needed to draw him out, force him into a direct confrontation. The leader ordered his men to take defensive positions, setting up traps and forming a perimeter. It was a desperate move, but it was all they had left. They needed to turn the tide somehow, make the gunslinger reveal himself. They couldn't keep losing men like this. But the gunslinger didn't take the bait. He was patient, methodical. Hours passed, and the tension only grew. Every minute felt like a lifetime as the bounty hunters waited for him to make a move. But instead of attacking, the gunslinger remained unseen, watching, waiting. He knew they were becoming more desperate with each passing moment. One of the hunters, on edge from the silence, fired into the shadows, his nerves getting the better of him. His shots hit nothing, but it was enough to send the group into a spiral of paranoia. They couldn't handle the pressure. The leader gritted his teeth, barking orders to keep them in line, but it was clear that the gunslinger's tactics were working. He didn't need to take them down one by one. He was letting them destroy themselves. Finally, the leader realized that they couldn't win this fight on Earth's terms. They needed to abandon their mission, regroup, and reassess. "Fall back to the ship," he commanded, his voice strained but firm. "We're pulling out." But as they began their retreat, the ground beneath them exploded into chaos. The gunslinger had anticipated their move. A series of small detonations rocked the streets, cutting off their path to escape. The leader cursed under his breath, realizing too late that the gunslinger had been playing them from the start. He hadn't been hiding, he had been guiding them, leading them into a trap. And now they were cornered. The bounty hunters tried to fight their way through, but it was futile. The gunslinger struck again, his shots precise and deadly, picking them off as they struggled to find cover. The leader, now one of the last remaining, knew this was the end. He could feel the weight of defeat bearing down on him. His team, once the most feared hunters in the galaxy, had been reduced to nothing by a lone man on a backwater planet. He had underestimated Earth, and now he was paying the price. His weapon felt heavy in his hands, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could win. In the chaos, he caught a glimpse of the gunslinger, a shadow moving through the dust and debris, too fast for him to lock onto. He fired blindly, desperation taking over, but the gunslinger didn't falter. Another shot rang out, and the leader felt a sharp pain in his leg as he dropped to the ground, his armor failing him once again. He tried to pull himself up, but his strength was gone. The gunslinger approached, his footsteps slow and deliberate. There was no sense of victory in his movements, no need to gloat. He was simply finishing what he had started. The leader looked up, his vision blurring from pain and exhaustion. He had never imagined it would end like this. He had faced some of the most dangerous criminals in the galaxy, but nothing had prepared him for this. As the gunslinger stood over him, the leader knew there was no point in fighting. He had lost, and he accepted it. His hand released its grip on his weapon, and he closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But the final shot never came. Instead, the gunslinger turned and walked away, leaving the leader to his fate. It wasn't about killing. It was about sending a message. The leader watched in disbelief as the gunslinger disappeared into the distance. He wasn't just an outlaw. He was something far more dangerous, an idea, a force that couldn't be defeated with technology or brute strength. The leader had learned that too late. Earth had its protector, and the galaxy would soon learn to fear him. The bounty hunters had been broken, their numbers reduced to almost none. Those who survived were battered, limping back toward their ship, their once proud armor scuffed and useless against the gunslinger's relentless precision. The few left barely spoke, their arrogance stripped away, leaving only the raw fear that had settled deep into their bones. They had underestimated him, and now all that was left was the bitter sting of defeat. The leader, still nursing the wound in his leg, glanced at the remaining men. They were in no condition to keep fighting. Their equipment, their technology, none of it mattered anymore. The gunslinger had picked them apart using nothing but skill and instinct. It was clear now that this battle had never been about who had the better gear, or the superior training. It had been about survival, and the gunslinger had mastered that far better than any of them. The leader's mind raced as they huddled together, trying to come up with a new plan. Their ship was close, but not close enough. They couldn't make it out of the town without being exposed, and the gunslinger was still out there, watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. Every step they took felt like they were walking straight into his crosshairs. The ship felt like a distant dream now, just out of reach. Suddenly, a sound from the far end of the street sent a ripple of tension through the group. They spun around, weapons at the ready, but the street was empty. Just the wind, or maybe another trap. The gunslinger didn't need to reveal himself to keep them on edge. He had already done enough to make them fear every shadow, every corner. They had been reduced to prey, and the gunslinger was the predator. The leader cursed under his breath, the pain in his legs slowing him down as they moved. He couldn't show weakness. Not now. Not when they were so close to getting out of this nightmare. "Keep moving," he muttered to the others, his voice low but steady. "We can still make it." But deep down, he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. The gunslinger had been toying with them, leading them wherever he wanted. It was only a matter of time before he made his final move. As they neared the edge of the town, the group stopped, scanning the area ahead. There, in the open, was the last stretch between them and their ship. No cover, no way to hide. The leader knew what this meant. If they made a run for it, the gunslinger would pick them off before they even got halfway. But staying here wasn't an option either. They couldn't outlast him. He had shown that time and time again. The leader weighed his options, his mind calculating the risks. But before he could make a decision, one of the remaining hunters panicked. With a sudden burst of fear-fueled desperation, the hunter sprinted toward the ship, breaking from the group. The others shouted after him, but it was too late. The hunter's footsteps echoed loudly in the silent street, each one a target for the gunslinger. In a flash, a single shot rang out, clean and precise. The hunter collapsed mid-stride, his body skidding to a stop in the dirt. The remaining group didn't need to look to know what had happened. The gunslinger had struck again, and now they were down to just two. The leader's heart pounded in his chest. He had no choice. They couldn't wait any longer. With a deep breath, he signaled to the last hunter beside him. "We go together. Now." The two of them sprinted toward the ship, their feet pounding against the ground as the ship loomed closer. The leader's leg burned with pain, but he pushed through it, his mind focused on one thing: survival. Another shot echoed, and the hunter beside him fell, a clean shot straight through his chest. The leader didn't stop. He couldn't. The ship was right there, only a few more feet. He could make it. He had to make it. But just as he reached the open hatch, he felt a sharp, burning pain in his shoulder. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the ship, the force of the bullet nearly knocking him off his feet. Gritting his teeth, he pulled himself inside, slamming his hand against the control panel to close the hatch behind him. The doors sealed shut with a hiss, and for the first time in hours, he felt a brief sense of relief. He had made it. Barely, but he had made it. Inside the ship, the silence was deafening. The leader leaned against the wall, his breathing heavy, his shoulder bleeding from the fresh wound. He glanced out the small window, half expecting to see the gunslinger standing there, watching him. But the street was empty. For a moment, the leader allowed himself to breathe, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. His team, his reputation, all of it was gone. He had failed. Earth was supposed to be easy. The outlaws here were supposed to be beneath them. But the gunslinger had shown him that no matter how advanced their technology was, no matter how skilled they thought they were, there was always someone better. The ship's engines hummed to life as the leader prepared to leave the planet. He couldn't stay here any longer. The mission was a failure, but his life wasn't worth losing over it. As the ship lifted off, the leader stared down at the town below, his thoughts racing. He knew that the story of the gunslinger would spread throughout the galaxy. The legend of the man who had brought down an entire team of elite hunters. And there would be no laughter, no mocking this time. The bounty hunters had laughed at Earth's outlaws. But the gunslinger had changed everything. And now, no one would ever underestimate Earth again. The ship broke through Earth's atmosphere, leaving the desolate town behind as it climbed into the cold vastness of space. The leader, wounded and alone, sat in the cockpit, his hands gripping the controls tightly. The pain in his shoulder was unbearable, but he ignored it. His mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the last few days, every mistake, every wrong assumption. The bounty hunters had come to Earth expecting an easy victory, but they had been torn apart by one man, a legend they had refused to believe in until it was too late. He glanced at the empty seats behind him, where his team should have been. They had been some of the best hunters in the galaxy, elite in every sense, yet the gunslinger had taken them down with nothing but skill and cunning. The leader knew that word of their defeat would spread quickly. The other bounty hunters scattered across the galaxy would hear about what had happened on Earth, and there would be no hiding from it. The thought gnawed at him. His reputation, once unshakable, was now in ruins. No one would fear him anymore. He had been bested by an Earth outlaw, a man he had dismissed as nothing more than a myth. He had laughed at the warnings, at the stories, and now, he had paid the price. There was no escaping the truth. He had failed. As the ship soared through the stars, the leader's thoughts drifted back to the gunslinger. How had he done it? How had one man outsmarted an entire team of experienced hunters? It wasn't just about skill with a weapon. The gunslinger had something more, something that none of them had understood until it was too late. It was as if he had known exactly what they would do before they did it, as if he had been playing a game they weren't even aware of. The leader's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the ship's navigation controls. He had to report back, had to explain what had happened. But what could he say? That a lone outlaw from Earth had single-handedly dismantled their entire operation? No one would believe it, not without seeing the wreckage themselves. But they would have to believe it. The evidence was clear, and the gunslinger's reputation would only grow from here. He set a course for a distant space station, one of the many hubs where bounty hunters gathered to share information, collect bounties, and trade war stories. He dreaded the conversation that awaited him there. The other hunters would ask questions, demand answers. They would want to know how a group of the galaxy's finest had been brought down by a single man. And there would be no good answer. There was no excuse for what had happened. As the ship neared the space station, the leader took a deep breath, steeling himself for the inevitable. His pride had been shattered, but there was no avoiding the truth. He had to face it, just as his men had faced the gunslinger. He docked the ship and stepped out, his injured leg and shoulder making each step a struggle. The station's lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cold metal floor. The hunters inside turned to look as he entered. They had heard something had gone wrong, but they didn't know the full extent yet. Their eyes followed him as he made his way to the center of the room, and the silence grew heavy. Finally, one of the older hunters, a grizzled man with scars covering his face, stepped forward. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. The leader swallowed, his throat dry. He had to choose his words carefully, but there was no point in sugarcoating the truth. "The mission failed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were outsmarted. Outgunned." The room remained silent, the other hunters waiting for more. They needed to understand. "The gunslinger, he took us down. One by one." A murmur spread through the room, disbelief evident in their expressions. The leader braced himself for their reactions. Some would mock him, others would demand proof, but all of them would know that things had changed. Earth was no longer the easy target they had all believed it to be. And the gunslinger? He was no longer just a story told in the shadows. As the leader spoke, recounting the events in painful detail, the mood in the room shifted. No one interrupted him. No one laughed. They listened, and as they did, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The gunslinger wasn't just an outlaw. He was a force to be reckoned with, a protector of Earth in ways no one had anticipated. His name would spread far and wide, and bounty hunters across the galaxy would think twice before setting foot on Earth again. By the time the leader finished his account, the room was filled with a quiet, uneasy respect. They all knew the truth now. Earth wasn't the joke they had made it out to be, and the gunslinger had proven that beyond any doubt. The leader stood there, his body aching, his pride in tatters, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The legend of the gunslinger would grow, and with it, Earth's reputation would change forever. As the leader left the station, heading back to his ship, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The galaxy had many dangerous places, many feared figures, but now Earth had its own. The bounty hunters had once laughed at Earth's outlaws, But no one would be laughing anymore. The Gunslinger had made sure of that. And in the quiet of space, as the leader's ship drifted away from the station, the echo of the Gunslinger's legend began to spread, whispered from one planet to the next, carried by those who had witnessed the impossible.